Have you ever asked yourself, who's the me that thinks my thoughts? Or where does that voice in my head come from, the one that comments on everything I do? And yes, even if it sounds a little crazy at first, that part of you that's constantly searching for truth out there might actually be the biggest obstacle to finding it. As Krishnamurti once said, when the observer realizes he is the observed, understanding is born. This idea, subtle yet transformative, invites us to radically break away from the way we see ourselves. And this isn't just some mental trick or a feel-good quote you'd share on Instagram. It's a shift in perspective that can flip your entire existence upside down and maybe for the first time, set it right side up. At some point, all of us carry the weight of a suffocating self-awareness, the constant feeling of being judged, not by others, but by ourselves. You act, and immediately the voice appears. That was good. That was bad. That was appropriate. That inner narrator is like a sports commentator narrating a game he himself invented. The most astonishing part? Despite all that mental noise, we still believe that's who we are. But what if that voice is just background noise? What if the real you is the one who listens? Silent, attentive, always present, yet never opinionated. What if instead of trying to shut that voice up, you simply turn to notice who is doing the listening? This isn't a journey towards some new place. It's a deep recognition of something that's already here. What you're looking for is what you already are. The consciousness trying to understand the world is the very same one that gives rise to it. And when you realize that, maybe, just maybe, something quiet awakens. Something that's always been there. Let's step together into the center of this mystery. And who knows? By the end, maybe you won't even need answers, because the questions themselves will have dissolved. Most people who begin an inner journey make a very common mistake. They close their eyes and try to observe themselves, but they end up confusing that inner voice, the one constantly commenting on everything as if it were the true observer. But it isn't. This misunderstanding is so widespread that even experienced meditators can spend years trapped in it. It's like trying to quiet a noisy room by shouting, "Silence!" over the crowd. The mind is so good at imitating itself that it ends up fooling you. That inner commentator shows up in three main disguises: the narrator, the critic, and the cheerleader. It's the narrator who turns your day into a play-by-play, like it's some kind of movie. It's the critic who blames you when things go wrong. And it's the cheerleader who pumps you up when you get it right. But above all, it's the part of you that's always trying to define who you are. And here's the tricky thing. It feels separate from your daily life, like some calm, detached entity floating above everything that happens. But in reality, it's just another performance. It's the ego dressed up as a wise man. Imagine for a moment you're sitting in a cafe. You hear cups clinking, conversations in the background, someone laughing loudly at a distant table. Now picture yourself ignoring your own coffee and focusing only on all those voices around you. That's what the inner commentator is. Background noise you've mistaken for your essence. It seems like an observer, but it's only an echo. It doesn't see. It just reacts. The true observer, on the other hand, is mute. It doesn't think, it doesn't judge, it doesn't say, this is good or this is bad. It simply is. It watches the inner commentator doing its thing, coming and going, but never interferes. Not because it doesn't care, but because it already knows. None of those voices define you. As Krishnamurti wrote, the observer is the observed. When that realization happens, the separation vanishes. The commentator is a product of the mind, shaped by your history. It feeds on your insecurities, your desires, your traumas, your memories. It's conditioned, formed by childhood, culture, fears, and forgotten dreams. And because of that, it's unstable. One day it calls you a failure, the next a genius, always swinging back and forth, never steady, and that's why it's so hard to see that voice for what it is. It sounds intimate. It knows your deepest wounds. But intimacy isn't identity. Just because something sounds familiar doesn't mean it's true. The real breakthrough happens the first time you experience that strange silence between one thought and the next. In the middle of a breath, everything pauses for just a moment. In that instant, brief, almost imperceptible, you're not thinking, yet you're fully aware. You're not commenting, you're simply present. That is the observer. It's the part of you that witnesses the inner storm without getting drenched. The one that sees fear without hiding, love without clinging, sadness without trying to push it away. It's in that space where real transformation occurs, because once you realize the commentator isn't you, you stop fighting with it. And the curious thing is, the moment you stop fighting, it also quiets down, and in that silence, you find yourself. The most common mistake is searching for the observer, as if it were a separate refuge, some safe hideout. But it isn't a place. It's the space in which everything happens. And once you recognize it, there's nothing more to do. Like Alan Watts said, you don't need to try to be yourself. You already are. If that sounds liberating, it's because it is. But at the same time, it's just the beginning. There's something deeply unsettling when you start to realize that the most essential part of you has no voice, no opinions, no judgments. It just observes. The true observer doesn't need to convince, correct, or justify anything. It doesn't interfere or try to control. It's simply present, like the sky receiving all the clouds without ever becoming one of them. That observer is silence, but not a dead or empty silence. It's a living silence, full of presence. It's there when you feel anger, when you laugh at a joke, when you fall in love, or when you're afraid. It's right here, in this very moment, as you hear these words, but it's not the one thinking about what's being said. It's the one that notices the thoughts reacting. This is the point where many people give up. Because the mind, always eager to label and control, wants to pin down this observer. It wants to categorize it, name it, and fit it neatly into some theory to share at Sunday dinner. But the observer can't be trapped by words. Not because it's complicated, but because it's too simple. It's so close, so fundamental, that the mind just slips off whenever it tries to grab hold of it. That's why so many spiritual teachers contradict each other when they try to describe it. For some, it's God. For others, it's the void. Some call it the soul, others pure awareness. Krishnamurti described it as a state of choiceless attention. The Upanishads call it Atman, the eternal self, the silent witness of every experience. Buddhists call it Rigpa, the naked awareness beyond time. And for Stoics like Marcus Aurelius, the secret was to observe your own thoughts as though you were someone else, calmly, with clarity. Different traditions give it different names, but the experience is always the same, a state of awareness that sees everything without getting entangled in anything. And here's the beautiful part. When you realize the observer is silent, you also realize that silence isn't the absence of life. It's its very essence. The noise, the thoughts, the emotions, they come and go. But the silence that perceives them remains. It isn't something you invent, it's something you recognize. Think back to that moment you were completely absorbed, watching the ocean, staring into a fire, or listening to a song that made you forget yourself for just a little while. That state of wordless enchantment was the observer revealing itself, not as something separate, but as you, stripped of all the layers. And that's why it's universal. The observer witnessing your thoughts right now is the same one that watched the thoughts of the Buddha, of a Tibetan monk, of a child playing alone, or of someone lost in thought on a subway in Tokyo. The experiences differ, but the space of awareness is the same. That silent awareness is like a mirror. It reflects everything without being stained by anything. And the more familiar you become with that silence, the more you realize that everything you thought you were, your name, your story, your desires, your fears, are just temporary shapes passing across the unmoving backdrop of your presence. The mind shouts, the observer listens. The mind analyzes, the observer simply sees. The mind wants to solve, the observer simply is. You don't have to try to be the observer. You already are. What you need is to notice the moments when you get lost in the commentator and gently return to the silence that observes. And maybe, in that process, you'll realize that everything you've always been searching for, peace, freedom, meaning, was never out there. It was always in the gap between one thought and the next, in the silence between two words, in the space between you and the world. So the real question isn't, how do I find the observer? The question becomes, why do I keep forgetting it? There's a strange, almost unnameable experience that we've all had, but rarely notice. That feeling that, even though everything in you has changed over the years, your body, your tastes, your ideas, your certainties, something has stayed the same. The gaze behind your eyes. The silent presence that has witnessed everything from childhood until now. What is that unchanging something inside of us? That's where we begin to touch the timeless aspect of the observer. Think about it. When you were 5 years old, you looked at the world and felt, I am. Decades later, that sense of existence is still intact. You may have changed completely on the outside, but something inside you has remained the same. That something doesn't belong to time. It doesn't move with the seasons of life. It notices change, but it doesn't change with it. Krishnamurti said the observer is the observed, because when you realize there's no separation between the one who sees and what is seen, you transcend duality. There's no longer subject and object. There's only consciousness witnessing itself in countless forms. And at that point, the very idea of identity dissolves. This awareness has no name, no age, no past, no future. It's the space where time unfolds, yet it isn't touched by time. The philosopher Alan Watts compared it to a jazz improvisation. There's no central conductor, just a living, flowing, spontaneous movement with no fixed direction, yet somehow perfectly coherent. The observer is that silence beneath the music. This idea is so powerful it cuts across cultures and eras. In the Upanishads, the sacred Hindu texts, it says, the inner self is unmoving, yet it moves everything. It is far away, yet very near. It is within all things, yet outside of all things. Christianity speaks of the kingdom of God within you. Zen Buddhism points to the original face you had before your parents were born. All of these teachings carry the same invitation, to recognize what is eternal in the midst of the fleeting. And why does that matter? Because when you recognize the timeless within yourself, it radically changes the way you face pain, attachment, and even the fear of death. You realize your essence isn't trapped in time. What dies in you, your stories, your roles, your masks, was never truly you. Those were contents, not the container. Most of our suffering comes from trying to preserve what can't be preserved. We cling to memories, to people, to ideas of who we think we are. Like trying to hold water in our hands, it all slips through. And the suffering comes from trying to control the uncontrollable. But the observer doesn't cling. It doesn't try to hold on. It simply watches, lets go, and remains. That's true freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom from being dragged along by what you are not. Writer Eckhart Tolle echoed this when he said, "You are not the voice in your head. You are the one who hears it." And here's where it gets even more radical. The observer is not yours. It's not private property, not a spiritual trophy you earn. It's the same in everyone. The only thing that changes is the passing content, thoughts, emotions, experiences. But the space that perceives them is one and the same. That's why, when you recognize the observer, something inside you relaxes. The walls start to fall. The separation between you and others begins to look like an illusion. The same silence that watches in you is the one watching in them. The same background behind your eyes is behind everyone's eyes. That's what mystics call universal consciousness. And this isn't about belief. It's not a matter of faith. It's about seeing, sitting in silence until the separation dissolves, until time itself seems to stop, until all that remains is presence. As a Zen master once said, before awakening, mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers. During awakening, mountains are no longer mountains and rivers are no longer rivers. After awakening, mountains are once again mountains and rivers are once again rivers. When you see through the eyes of the observer, everything looks the same, and yet nothing is as it was before. So, how would it feel to live from that silent place? Not as some lofty spiritual concept or a nice idea to pull out in a crisis, but as a living practice. What if, instead of trying to change the contents of your mind, you simply recognize the space that allows it all to exist? Living from the observer means breaking the addiction to constant reaction. It's when something happens, a criticism, a compliment, a painful memory, and you're not immediately swept away by the emotional current. Not because you've become cold or indifferent, but because something in you has learned not to confuse itself with what appears. It's like sitting by the edge of a river, watching leaves float by. Some are beautiful, some are dirty, some are frightening, some nostalgic. But you don't jump into the river to grab them. You just watch. And in that clarity of observation, you act with wisdom. The observer isn't passivity. It's conscious presence, and that presence allows action free of ego. That freedom is real. It happens the moment you realize you no longer need to defend yourself from yourself. Think about how many times you felt trapped by obsessive thoughts or emotions that seemed bigger than you. But what if instead of fighting them, you just watched them? Without judgment, without rushing, without trying to fix anything? That's the space where transformation happens. Not because you forced change, but because you stopped identifying with the storm. And here's the most beautiful part. The more you live from the observer, the more compassionate you become. Because you start to see that others are also trapped in their inner commentators, reacting to old stories, clinging to fragile identities. And when you understand that, a deep tenderness for human suffering arises. Not superiority, but kinship. The anger of another becomes understandable. Their pain moves through you, because the one observing in them is the same one observing in you. As Rumi wrote, "Beyond ideas of right and wrong, there is a field. I'll meet you there." That presence begins to change everything. You start to really listen. You respond instead of react. You feel life more vividly. The sunlight spilling across a wall, the smell of fresh coffee, the sound of unexpected laughter. Living from the observer is rediscovering simplicity. It's finding peace without needing to escape. It's being whole, even when everything feels broken. And the beauty of it is, it doesn't require you to become someone new. You don't have to abandon your life, your commitments, or your personality. What changes is not what you live, but where you live from. Before, you were the actor trapped in the role. Now you're the stage that holds the entire play. As Zen wisdom says, sit down, observe, do nothing. The world reveals itself on its own. Living from the observer is living without losing yourself. It's remembering, moment by moment, that you are the space, not the contents, the awareness, not the thought, the sky, not the clouds. And from that place, everything feels lighter, not because the problems vanish, but because you stop carrying them in your mind. They come, they exist, they pass, and you remain. You've always been here. You always will be. In this journey, we've walked along a silent path, perhaps the most silent of all, turning inward. But not toward the conditioned self made of stories and memories, toward the one who observes it all, untouched, the one who's here now, as you breathe, as you think, as you feel, the one who's been here all along. The truth is, you don't need to reinvent yourself, you only need to remember, and remembering isn't about effort, it's about surrender, like a leaf that stops resisting the wind and simply dances. The observer is the dance, the silence between the steps. It doesn't want to be found, it only needs to be noticed. Years ago, on an ordinary morning, I was sitting on the edge of my bed. My mind was a whirlwind. Fears, decisions, a tangle of voices that wouldn't stop. And then, completely unexpectedly, everything went silent. For a brief moment, something in me simply observed the chaos and did nothing. It didn't judge, it didn't try to solve. It just watched, and in that second, I understood. I am not all that noise. That moment was the beginning of an irreversible change. Since then, silence has been my greatest teacher, and that is what I share with you here. Not a theory, but a lived experience. If you've made it this far, thank you. Thank you for opening a space within yourself to question, to reflect, and maybe, just maybe, to recognize yourself a little more deeply. Before you go, if you want to continue exploring these kinds of hidden truths about the mind and self, subscribe to the channel. It's a simple step, but it helps keep this space alive and lets us keep walking this path together. And if you'd like, leave a comment sharing the moment that resonated with you most. Who knows? Your insight might help someone else who's also lost in the noise. Remember, you're not alone. You never were. We'll meet again, in the silence.